So thank you all for coming. This is our gallery talk with Carole Genshaft. Carole is the curator at large of the Columbus Museum of Art. She is also a scholar of the work and life of Aminah Brindlin Robinson. Carole knew Aminah. She's also written about her and her work. And she also, anyway, Carole knows Aminah's work very well. She actually curated an exhibition at the Columbus Museum of Art called Symphonic Tone, which was a major exhibition that traveled. And Carole was one of the co-curators of that exhibition. And today she's going to talk about the Presidential Suite. This is the last major body of work created by Aminah Brindlin Robinson. As many of you know, Aminah passed away a year ago in May, and this was the last major body of work she did. And it was, well, for her, the election of President Barack Obama was a major event, as it was for many of us, historically and personally. So she created this body of work in dedication to him and inspired by him, and now we have it on display. The Columbus Museum of Art is also cooperating with us. We are very grateful for them to be working on this project with us. There are some other works from the Presidential Suite on display there. And so if you get the chance, please stop by the Columbus Museum of Art also. But thank you for coming, and thank you, Carole, for doing this, and thank you to the Columbus Museum of Art for collaborating with us on this project. And with that, I will pass things on to Carole.
Thanks, Chet. Well, good evening, everyone. I want to start by just actually thanking Chet and Laura and Marlena. Where's Marlena? Back there. And Nikki and Chris and all the people here at Hammond Harkins. You know, they represent Aminah, but they do it in such a, they were so close with her, and they feel so deeply about her work and the legacy of her work that they've always been a pleasure to work with and so helpful in so many ways. So thanks, guys. And as Chet mentioned, so this is kind of a collaboration between the gallery and the Columbus Museum of Art. I invite all of you, if you haven't been to the museum, we have just a small number of works from the Presidential Suite. I'll be talking about them today, but please come and see them. They're going to be there kind of on an ongoing basis because our school groups love looking at Aminah's work. So I've promised our learning department that they could stay up through spring. So they're there quite a long time. But you know, Aminah's work is all about bridges and connections and journeys. And she brings together, these are ways of linking people all over the world. She believes so deeply in the African concept of Sankofa, the fact that you can't really go forward unless you know from whence you came. And so to her, it's really incumbent upon all of us to not only remember the past, but try and understand the past, and if it's appropriate, to honor the past. It's really important. And another concept that's equally important to Aminah, and that you'll see reflected in this work, is that you know, we have a lot in common. We can have, you know, differences in the way we look, the clothes we wear, the languages that we speak. But when Aminah went to Africa in 1979, she did a study trip and went to 6 different countries. And she said, I had to go all the way to Africa to find Poindexter Village, the neighborhood here in Columbus where she grew up. And what she meant is that in all her travels, and after Africa, she's been to Italy and Chile and Peru and a residency in Israel. She saw the same kinds of things. She saw that families cared for each other, were trying to raise their children, take care of their elders. She saw, you know, socializing in marketplaces. She loved to go to marketplaces and see what they were selling and making, and that people were trying to make a living to support their families. And she came back to Columbus, Ohio, and saw the very same things. So that's part of her message. And a third thing that's important is that, and this is really important for this group of work, is that no one just kind of pops up by themselves. None of us are here just solely by ourselves. We're all the product of our families and our ancestors and the communities in which we live. And so what she's done in the presidential suite is she's kind of merged the backgrounds of President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama into this body of work. And through it, she's really just spans generations, and she's linked these very kind of diverse and dispersed communities, such as Kenya and Indonesia and in South Carolina, Hawaii. So you'll see that in all of this work. And the reason I wanted to start with this piece, which is Hope is to Remember on Behalf of the Ancestors and of the People of Today and Those to Come. So in this piece, in a very succinct way, she's kind of laid out how important she feels it is understanding the past as a means of being in the present and also the future. The figures in this particular, and this she called a rag painting, I'll talk about that in a moment, but they seem to be floating almost. And if you notice, they're transparent. Their faces are transparent and their hands are transparent. So I believe this captures the spirit of souls. And these, this is a limited number, but it really represents a very large kind of a gathering of people who have lived and who are living today and who will live in the future. So I think it's very indicative of all of this work. Probably many of you know that Aminah was a very early riser. She got up very early in the morning and she went to bed late at night, and she created a lot of work. But what you may not know is that she wrote a lot as well. She kept an amazing amount of journals, and she would write about a lot of the work that she did. And this is what she had to say about the presidential suite. Hope is to remember on behalf of our ancestors. Hope is to remember on behalf of our young people coming up and those yet to come. Hope is to remember on behalf of the powerless so that we ensure the future is fair and merciful. Hope becomes the preservation of our humanity. It is our responsibility to remember. This body of work, the presidential suite, is a reminder, a cautionary tale that the wrongs of the past must not be repeated in the new millennium. Aminah was absolutely profoundly overjoyed when Barack Obama was elected president the first time. But she also, I think, had this guarded optimism, this guarded hope that perhaps by looking back and remembering what had happened before, the suffering, the tragedies, that we could eliminate some of that in the future. But I don't, like most people, she knew that racism and bigotry wouldn't be eliminated overnight. But she was very hopeful that maybe things, would get a little better. And I'll leave that to you whether you think they have or not. The other thing you might notice on these rag paintings and on the RagGonNon, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes, is that the entire name of this body of work is called the Book of Revelations, the Presidential Family and Community Suite. And I'm sure you can figure out what the Family and Community Suite is about. But the Book of Revelation is the last book of the New Testament. And if you've read it, it is full of brimstone and fire and of these visions and prophecies. There are seven-headed dragons. There are monsters from the sea. There's a bloodied moon and a blackened sun. And it's really apocalyptic literature that predicts the end of times. But at the end of the book, it does say that in the end, ultimately, good will prevail and will defeat evil. So it's rather hopeful. And I think that is what really resonated with Aminah and why she called this body of work the Book of Revelations. And I want to talk a little bit about Aminah's process. Aminah was a very spiritual person. She didn't participate a lot in organized religion, but she really believed that God spoke to her and that her work was kind of a part of that God actually she was kind of a vessel, and God was operating through her and her work. And so she kind of had a vision, she said, of what this work should be, and she did a lot of research. Now, she didn't own a computer, but she did get the Columbus Dispatch every day and the New York Times on the weekends. And I'm telling you, she got her money out of these. She read them cover to cover. And so, of course, before Obama was elected, there was a lot about the family and their ancestry. And she read all that. She clipped it. She put it into files. So she knew a lot about their backgrounds. And she didn't need the internet, but she knew a lot, and that's kind of where she started. And she started working on this body of work, and she's done other bodies of work like this. So she didn't just do one thing at a time. The dates on this are like 2007 to 2010. So it was a period of time, and she would work on different aspects. So she might do these watercolors that you see over here that are so bright and beautiful. She did a series of woodcuts that are back here that you might want to take a look at. She loved doing woodcuts. She would get these pieces of wood and a chisel or a gouge, and the wood was kind of soft, and she could kind of chisel out the pattern that she was trying to, or the scene she was trying to depict. And then she would actually send these to New York to be printed. I remember watching her actually do another series, and the chips were flying. You know, it was like being in a lumber yard or something. And she loved the physicality, I think, of actually doing those wood prints, those woodcut prints. So those were going on at the same time. And of course, in her living room, she had her RagGonNon going, which is this monumental piece that I will get to in a few minutes. So you got, this was all going on simultaneously. But I think the heart of this body of work is actually the long horizontal pieces that she called rag paintings. And the way that she would do these, she would first take separate pieces of paper, and you can see that. She would then put them together with thread and buttons, and I'll talk about the buttons in a minute. And then she would either dye the paper, or she might use watercolor wash to have a background. And she would then plot out what she wanted to, the design of the piece, in probably pencil or graphite. And then she would use pen and ink to fill in the features of the faces and the hands on these type of work, or some of the details. And then she had little swatches, little fabric scraps that she would use in the same way that another artist might use paint to kind of fill in and build up her piece. And so you see the beginnings of one right here. And then I love this, she collected these really heavy old irons, flat irons, and she would attach the fabric with glue, and then she'd put the weight of the irons on top of them to make sure it adhered to the paper. And those are really kind of wonderful. So the buttons, okay, so the buttons, you know, Aminah's mother did button work, and she learned that from her mother, and her mother probably learned it from her mother. And so I think the button work that her mother had her and her two sisters, her older sister Sue and her younger sister Sharon, do were twofold. I think they liked the way they looked. She would give her daughters lots of buttons, and they would sew them on cloth, and then they'd put the cloths, they called them button tablecloths, they put them on furniture or on the arms of chairs, but I think it also kept the girls busy and kept them out of trouble. But so for Aminah, the buttons are really important. They represent that connection to her family, and they also represent the spirit of the people who wore the clothes that the buttons were on. And you know, people would bring Aminah buttons. They might knock on the door and actually hand them to her, or they'd leave them on the step. And on a number of occasions I know of, people would, and it was usually women would be cleaning out maybe their mother or their aunt had passed away, and they were cleaning out their things, and they found this jar of buttons, and they would bring it to Aminah. And so I think there's this kind of level of almost sacredness about these pieces, because they represent people that are both the donors living and those maybe who have passed away. So they're very, very special. And the other thing is, you know, Aminah was really an early feminist. She always believed firmly in the power and the strength of women. She did a series years ago called A Clutch of Blossoms, all about women. And she did her unwritten love letters, where she would steam open letters she received, and then she would paint them, dye them, and then draw on them. And she did a whole series of African-American writers and civil rights workers. She just really, I think, believed strongly in the strength of women. And you know, the kind of work with the buttons and the sewing, for many, many, many decades, has kind of been dismissed as women's work. And I think the way Aminah uses it, it raises the status to really, I think, as a fine art. So that's that's really important for her too. She did this research, and of course she found out that Barack Obama's father was born, lived, and worked in Kenya. And so this first little group we'll look at are pieces that refer to Kenya. So his father came to the United States to attend the University of Hawaii. He was an economist, and that's where he met Obama's mother. They eventually married and had the young Barack Obama, and they got divorced just about 3 years later. So he actually, Obama only saw his father one other time. He came to visit in Hawaii for a month. So he was kind of far removed. Obama spent a lot of time with his maternal grandparents. And at any rate, but he had very, very proud feelings of his African background. He was very proud of that. He visited Kenya, and so that's really a part of his ancestry. And here you have, this is the little piece that's right at the door. You see these women are going about their business, maybe doing laundry, maybe cooking, maybe doing grocery shopping. And it's just this wonderful little small piece. You have the kinta cloth on the side as well. But then Aminah has revisited those same figures, and you see them down here in the bigger piece. But these women are working or doing their daily kinds of things in the shadow of this 16th century Portuguese building that actually became a slave house. So again, that kind of important history is present even as these women are going about what they're doing. And the house itself is, and this piece, by the way, let me backtrack. There's about 60 objects in this suite of work, and we don't have them all on display. These are very long, and we didn't have space for them either here at the gallery or at the museum. So that's one of these you won't be able to see in person. But the slave house almost, Nanette's here somewhere, it reminds me of a birch field. It almost seems the windows have human eyes, and the little archway seems to be almost a mouth that kind of ate these people up. So I think, again, the spirit of those slaves who probably died or were, sold into slavery. This is actually on the east coast of Africa, but it's almost, it's a kind of frightening place. And then this is, the ones on top are some of the watercolors that are around here somewhere, but again, of people in various positions going about their daily business. And then the one on the bottom is another, it's called the homecoming. And in African American culture, the notion of a homecoming really seems to have started in the early 20th century, associated with church functions, and people would celebrate certain events. So Aminah has called all of this series about Kenya preparing for homecoming. And I don't know what homecoming exactly she had in mind. It could have been that there was some kind of homecoming in Kenya at that particular moment. But also, if you look on the internet, they're now pushing all these homecoming tours to Africa for non-Africans. So it's another way of having people come home to their roots, that sort of thing. Or maybe they were preparing for one of Obama's trips to Kenya. President Obama did go to Kenya about a month after Aminah passed away, and it was the first time a sitting president went to Kenya. And he made a number of speeches, but one of the things he said I think would have really resonated with Aminah. He said, in the end, we are all part of one tribe, the human tribe. I think Aminah would have approved of that. And so then, so Obama's parents got divorced. Obama, the young Obama, and his mother were in Hawaii, and his mother was getting degrees, a master's degree and a PhD in anthropology. And her area of study happened to be helping women economically in small villages in Indonesia. And she met a young man from Indonesia. He was a surveyor who was going to school at the University of Hawaii, and he became her second husband. And they had a number of kids together as well. But she stayed with the young Obama in Hawaii for several years. And then when he was 6 years old, she took him to Jakarta, and he lived there for about 3.5, 4 years, from first grade to like fourth grade. And here again, he went back as president, and this is what he remembered. He said, "We lived in a small house, we had a mango tree out front, and I learned to love Indonesia while flying kites and running along the paddy fields and catching dragonflies, buying satay and baza, which are meatballs they sell from the street vendors." But this piece is really quite wonderful, and this one is on view at the museum. It's called Fishermen Mending Their Nets. And of course, Aminah loves to use found objects. And here she used echo bags, which are those little string bags that people take and reuse at the grocery store, so they don't have to use up plastic bags and paper bags. But they work great as fishing nets in this scene. And she also has the fishermen wearing those conical hats, which really make this wonderful pattern. So each of the people, and I'm not convinced whether they're men or women, I think, again, they could be either, but their positions have us see these hats from different views. So each panel actually offers kind of a little pattern with the hats. Something that you kind of see throughout here is that Aminah really liked to kind of honor or look at the working people that grow the food that everybody ate. And so she realized that they raised sugarcane in Indonesia, in Hawaii, and in South Carolina. And I'll talk about the South Carolina connection when I talk about Michelle Obama in just a few minutes. But sugarcane, the production of sugarcane was just a very treacherous kind of job to have to do. You need a lot of water. There were snakes, there was mosquitoes. And sugarcane is a grass that grows very tall. It could be like 13 to 15 feet tall, very wide, strong fibers. And the slaves in the South, this became one of the major crops during slavery. And it was very, very harsh. The slaves would kind of be involved in cutting it down and then also in boiling the sugar cane to get the sugar. But what I love about this is sugar cane apparently has all this color to it, especially, I guess, after it's cut. So it has these beautiful kinds of plums and lemon colors. And I think Aminah really, again, she doesn't have the internet, but maybe she knew something about sugar cane, because that's reflected in this wonderful piece in which the workers are kind of intertwined with the sugar cane. And then you see some more watercolors as well. We'll switch over to Michelle Obama for a moment. So as you know, before the election and during, there was a lot of focus on both the kind of past and the families of the president and the first lady. Some scholars have pointed out, and I think it's correct, that as momentous as it was for us to elect the first African-American president, it was just as momentous for Michelle Obama to be our first lady. And the reason is because, like so many African-Americans, her past started in Africa when her family, her ancestors were forced into slavery in South Carolina, actually. And you know, a lot of genealogists and historians were focusing on her, so they found out things about her past that she didn't even know. And it turns out that her great-great-grandfather was a slave on a plantation in South Carolina called Friendfield near Georgetown, South Carolina. And so I think that really resonated with Aminah, because Aminah's family too had been, of course, originally from Africa, enslaved. They ended up on Sapelo Island, which is a sea island off the coast of Georgia. And then both Michelle Obama and Aminah, like so many other, probably 6 million other African Americans, were part of the Great Migration, who left the South and came north. And of course, Michelle Obama went to Chicago, and Aminah ended up right here in Columbus, Ohio. So I think that really meant a lot to Aminah. And here we have workers gathering rice in South Carolina, which they also do in Indonesia. Like the sugarcane, rice harvesting is treacherous. It needs a lot of water, so there are a lot of snakes, and there was disease, malaria, and yellow fever. One report that I read said that a third of the slaves who worked in these fields would die in a year. That's how bad it was. So I think, there's a lot of really suffering kind of history that Aminah is kind of referring to here. Again, Aminah loved this horizontal layout, and it allowed her to create this kind of rhythm. And I don't know why, but I think there's almost something musical about these pieces. They're just quite wonderful. And again, the many laborers are kind of intertwined with the rice plants that have all these little details on them. And here you have some real rice. I also have read that over 60% of the slaves that worked in the fields were women. So, there was no distinction particularly. Both the sugar cane production and rice completely plummeted after the Civil War because, of course, there was no slave labor and nobody wanted to do this kind of job. So even today, the production of sugar cane and rice in this country is quite low, much lower than it was then. And here's one of the woodcut prints that also talks about rice harvesting, and here's one planting rice. The slaves were involved in every phase of planting and harvesting these crops. A lot of West Africans who came over as slaves knew a lot about growing rice. And actually, the ones that knew a lot about growing rice commanded an even higher price because they became kind of advisors to the production of rice. And they were kind of isolated because this work was so hard. And in South Carolina and Georgia, they really kept their own traditions, and they even had a language, Gullah and Geechee, which was a combination of African tongues and English, that they continue to speak and still do to this day. But one of the great traditions that they brought with them was these coiled baskets. And it started with these very flat ones that are winnowing baskets that actually were used in the production of rice. They would throw these up and the wind would carry away the chaff from the seeds or from the rice. And they're not like many baskets which are woven. They're actually coiled. And early on they were made from bulrush, but then later on they were made from sweetgrass, which grows in the South, especially in the Sea Islands. And then they were coiled very tightly, so tightly that some of them would hold water. And they used different colors, so they would attach the coils with pine needles or with palmetto fronds, and you get these wonderful, wonderful combinations of color and shape. This is a tradition that's like 300 years old in this country. And after the Civil War, and it was usually women, some men did make these, but it was usually women, they would sell these to like museum shops or to little stores. And then they realized that if they put out their own booths and sold them themselves, that they would get that much more money. They didn't have to split it with a middleman. So that's what happened. And what happened was that there was a little stretch, a 3-mile stretch of Highway 17 in South Carolina, which is actually Route 40. And at its height, there were about 95 of these stalls with the basket makers. And of course, the real piece is right behind me, which is just so wonderful. But so kind of collectors and museums actually discovered these. There have been exhibitions of them. There was even a woman, I think her name is Mary Foreman, who won a MacArthur Genius Award, just as Aminah had done, for these fabulous baskets. And of course, now they come in all different shapes and different colors, and they're quite costly. Aminah went to kind of seek out her roots in Sapelo Island, Georgia, and she bought several of these, and they were among her prized possessions. She also, she used lots of different ways of expressing her subjects, and one of them was this wonderful little book that's about yay big on handmade paper. I think she made the book as well, and it is just full of other versions of all these watercolors that you see. So it's about this big, and it's just quite wonderful, and that's on view at the museum as well. So, you know, the other big crop as far as during slavery was cotton. And this is a piece called Hot Boiling Sun Coming Over Me. From sunup to sundown, slaves picked cotton. Because of this horizontal design, I think it becomes a very kind of rhythmic piece with the arms of these, mainly women. There are a few children in the piece as well. But again, a lot of women actually worked in the fields. And it has this wonderful rhythm that is kind of enhanced by the white of the cotton bowls. And of course, these crops in the 20th century had become much more mechanized. And so a lot of this work, this very tedious, long hours and hard work is now done by machinery. And here, a watercolor and a woodcut of the same subject, picking cotton. The cotton gin was invented, Eli Whitney, in like 1793, and what it did is it separated the cotton from the seed, and you would have thought that might have eased the slaves' horrible experiences, but it actually increased. They needed more slaves because they were able to bale more hay. And then these little clippings that I'm showing you, Aminah was an inverter, and she was a clipper. And she has files and files of things that she thought were interesting. So those pieces about Michelle Obama were all from her files, as are these about the Capitol. And the story, of course, with the Capitol and the White House are that about 2/3 of the laborers who worked on those buildings were slaves. And what's so surprising, I mean, that doesn't seem so shocking to us now, we kind of know that, but nobody talked about that for years and years and years. And in fact, it was only in as late as 2012 that the Capitol put up a plaque that indicates how much the slaves were involved with building the United States Capitol. And what happened, you know, Washington at that time was kind of a backwater, and it wasn't as populated, and they needed a lot of labor. And they actually would hire indentured servants like from Europe, but that wasn't enough. So then they started renting slaves from slave owners, and they paid the slave owners, not the slaves, for their work. So I think for Aminah, and this piece is at the museum. This is called Wings of Our Ancestors, the Slaves Who Labored and Built the Nation's Capital in Washington, D.C. In Aminah's mind, this is why I say it's not just enough to remember. She's also honoring those slaves who helped build those magnificent buildings. So that when you go to Washington and you walk in the White House or the Capitol, you think about who built it. And I think that was really important to her. Again, here, you know, it was George Washington who said that those two buildings should be faced with stone. And you see the stone that the slaves are dragging and hauling, and it was very hard work. But again, it makes this almost rhythmic kind of pattern. When you come to the museum, you should look closely because there's great expressions on the slaves' faces that you can discern. And she's also used in this piece some mud cloth from Africa, so that's kind of interesting as well. But I think she's really effectively kind of shown the strain and the hard work that was required here. And here's some watercolors that we have here in the gallery of the same subject. And then I was really taken, I'm sure many of you watched the Democratic National Convention, when Michelle Obama said, "The story of this country is the story of generations of people who felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation." This always makes me cry. But who kept on striving and hoping and doing what needed to be done, so that today I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves, and I watch my daughters, two beautiful, intelligent, black young women, playing with their dogs on the White House lawn. So I think that same ethos is really reflected in Aminah's work as well, that irony. And then I wanted to talk about the RagGonNon and the process of the RagGonNon. So RagGonNon is a word that Aminah created, and it's really better understood as rag on and on. And she always had, she had these going in her living room, and they were an additive kind of thing. She would add lots of cloth to them, and she never really saw them as you're seeing this now. It was always rolled up. And she created other ones for other bodies of work. And we would actually, in a couple cases, bring them to the museum on a Monday when we're closed and roll them out. We used to do it in Derby Court. Now the last one actually we did in the atrium, the new wing, before it was even finished. So she never would see these exactly, and she defined them as very complex work. They didn't have to be cloth. If you know her work, you know she did this fabulous chair called Gift of Love that we have at the museum and that was in the retrospective exhibition. She called that a RagGonNon too. She called these RagGonNons that were complex, that she said were layered. They often have music boxes. And the real key is that she wants you and me to look at them and figure out what it means to us. And I love it. Every time I've come in here, there have been people standing here discussing what's going on in this particular RagGonNon. So I hope you'll do that too afterwards. So we do know certain parts that she kind of told us about. So on top of the RagGonNon, looks like a quilt, a patchwork quilt. To her, that was kind of a map of all these various areas that had meant so much to the Obamas coming together. It was kind of a map of all these various places. And then there's a section over here, black and white, that is again a reference to building the Capitol, invisible wings of our ancestors. So there's a part here, it's very hard to read, so you have to come and look at it, of the Obama family in the Rose Garden. And this is another version of that, which is at the museum. And you know, I think a lot of this work is very serious. But if you knew Aminah, you know that she had a great sense of humor and she loved to laugh. And I think this is her little joke she's kind of leaving us with, because she's calling it Beau walking the first family through the Rose Garden. Beau is walking the most important person of the, president of the most powerful nation in the world, but he's being led by a dog, and actually maybe by his daughters and his wife as well. So that's in the, this piece is at the museum as well. And then in these files, I did come across a little drawing. So this piece is full of music boxes, and the little drawing tells what music she wanted to put with each of the figures, each of the Obamas. So I think the girls have It's a Small World, and Jesus Loves the Children, and I can't even read what this is. Jesus Loves Me is Michelle Obama's mother, who lives with them in the White House, and Obama's How Great Thou Art, that spiritual. Now, when we first looked at this, all of us, from the museum and the gallery, we couldn't quite. This last panel on the bottom is all about Chile, and we just couldn't quite figure out at first what that meant, but I've come to decide that it's really appropriate. So in 2004, the Ohio Arts Council gave Aminah a residency in Chile, and she was there for 3 weeks, and then they actually, in Chile gave her the first one-person exhibition of a living American artist at the Museum of Fine Arts in Santiago, and a whole bunch of us from the Ohio Arts Council and the museum, and some of you here, went down with her to see the exhibition. And she loved Chile, and she loved the Chilean people. And some of you might know that she used to say she had a boyfriend, and her boyfriend's name was Leonardo da Vinci. And she was pretty serious about that. But I think that Pablo Neruda, who is kind of the heroic poet of Chile, might have displaced Leonardo, because she fell in love with his poetry, and he was a political activist, and she was very much enthralled with with Neruda, and it says that right here. And she also has reference to Violeta Parra, who was a Chilean folk singer who talked a lot, who wrote songs about social injustice. It developed into this very well-known Chilean folk art songs called the New Song Movement. So that's there. But then, so that was 2004, and it could be that she did this one little part back in 2004 and then decided to kind of enhance it. But the other part about this is that this is in honor of the rescue of the 33 Chilean miners trapped underground for 69 days. If you remember, that was in 2010, and it captivated the world. I mean, everybody was watching to see if these 33 people were going to emerge. And so President Obama was very much encouraging, Americans to help any way they could, and there was actually equipment that came from NASA that helped get the miners out. And it was this really joyous moment when they emerged, if you recall. And later on, President Obama went to Santiago, and he talked about it. He said, if ever we needed a reminder of the humanity and the hopes that we share, that moment in the desert, which is where they were, was such. When a country like Chile puts its mind to it, there's nothing it can't do. When countries across Latin America come together and focus on a common goal, when the U.S. and others in the world do our part, there's nothing we can't accomplish together. And here again, I think this spoke to what Aminah is all about, and how when people come together, such wonderful positive things can happen. On this bottom part, there's also a little section that says, hymn to bottles and hymn to socks. And I think, I don't know, and I think Chet might have pointed this out to me, but Pablo Neruda wrote a whole book called Ode to Common Things. And I just have a little bit of this wonderful poem, but tell me if it doesn't remind you of Aminah. I have a crazy, crazy love of things. I like pliers and scissors. I love cups, rings, and bowls. Not to speak of course, of hats. And if you know, Aminah loved to wear hats. I love all things, not just the grandest, also the infinitely small. Thimbles, spurs, plates, and flower vases. These buttons and wheels and little forgotten treasures all bear the trace of someone's fingers on their handle or surface, the trace of a distant hand lost in the depths of forgetfulness. And I don't know for sure. I know Aminah had a number of books of Neruda's poetry, but I think that would have been one that really would have spoken to her. She said about this piece, as you can see, and that's probably where I'll end, it is my hope that his body of work can give some measure of hope, encouragement, this body of work, and enlightenment of historical, cultural, and ancestral lives for future generations. So I do encourage you to come over and take a look and see what you think, and let the piece rag on and on. And Aminah had this habit of having people write on her walls. And this is what she wrote, probably the day that Obama was elected the second time. Second time around, rejoice. President Obama elected to 4 more years, rejoice. We're gonna have a program on October 27th. It's free, but you have to register. So Columbus's first black mayor, Coleman, is going to discuss the Obama years with a professor, Jeffries from Ohio State. And I actually had lunch with both of them yesterday. And his stories, the mayor's stories, are great. You really are going to want to be there because he had some really special insights, and I think that's going to be a very interesting little session at the museum. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Stay and enjoy the work.